A Detroit story is, I think, the story of someone being down on the mat and coming back up off the mat and putting up his fists and saying, let's go at it.
Orchestral Hall has always been very important. And then when it fell into disrepair during the late 50s, 60s, even early 70s, I became a member of one of the committees that was established to try to help save Orchestral Hall.
There are times when you can't allow yourself to be thrown about by countervailing winds and trends. There's a point at which you just have to say, we stand for this. This is important. This needs to be here.
And so I love the history of saving the hall, because that was a moment in time when the community came together and said, this hall must be saved.
While the Orchestra Hall stage was in darkness for much of the 1950s and 60s, at times there were still glimpses of light. The Detroit Symphony Orchestra had only briefly closed and was revived during the war, and by 1952, its new musical director saw the value in a perfect acoustical space.
It's interesting because while there was nothing here on a regular basis, things still did happen here. In terms of the orchestra, most notably, is that the DSO makes a number of really extraordinary recordings here for the Mercury label in the 1950s and early 60s, conducted by Paul Paray.
There's a photograph of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra with Paul Paray on the stage of Old Orchestra Hall with one microphone hanging down.
The DSO came here, made distinguished recordings because the technology couldn't replace the impact and the feel of what it's like to be in the hall.
In spite of its occasional use as a recording studio, the fact that Orchestra Hall still had no permanent resident began to wear on the building. In 1970, plans were announced to tear down Orchestra Hall and build a new fast food restaurant on its lot, far from the fate that those who predicted a center of Detroit's musical life had suggested decades before.
Orchestra Hall was not the prettiest flower in any bouquet at that time. It had been totally abandoned for the previous 10 years. Holes in the roof, water in the basement. This has more of the appearance of a piece of Swiss cheese than it does a concert hall. And people had it easy. They could say, well, the building is old, it's got these problems, it should be torn down. Well, no, it's not. The building was really in remarkable condition because it was overly designed and overbuilt, so there was no reason to say that Orchestra Hall was crying out to be demolished.
There's a lot of lore about this hall, and some of it is true and some of it's not true and some of it might be true, but the idea that we almost lost this hall, that it was almost demolished, that's 100% true, but not for the actions of Paul Ganson, the bassoonist in the orchestra, who helped save Orchestra Hall, and the group of supporters around him.
We were looking for people with connections with Geno's Incorporated, the firm that bought Orchestra Hall and were going to tear it down within 2 weeks. We didn't have much money at all, but we had the offer of a mortgage. And they came to us and said, okay, we'll give you the time and we'll sell it to you for what we paid for it. So we ended up paying $100,200.
But even though quick action had saved Orchestra Hall from the wrecking ball, restoring it to its former glory would be another labor of love entirely, one that would last another 2 decades.
I think in the history of this hall, You can see that the philanthropic community has stepped up when it was really needed.
You had some major donors, but you also had lots of little donors. And I think what's really relevant here is that this hall had such a rich history that spoke to so many different parts of the community that it could draw upon a kind of broad-based support.
The key was, from what happened in this office, was to raise the money, period. So these were members of our community who were committed to rebuilding the hall, and they made phone calls and made assignments, and they stood up to the line as well.
That photograph of me on the roof of Orchestra Hall was actually from 1976, some 6 years later, when we were just beginning the real restoration, and so, because it was a matter not now of just saving and sealing the building, but actually to restore it to a state where there could be events in the hall, which began in the 1976-77 season.
So many musicians tell me about playing chamber music here when there was water dripping and birds flying and who knows what else. But the most amazing chamber music performances, and people from all over the world came here to play chamber music because of the properties of acoustics.
1976, I believe, is when the Chamber Music Society of Detroit began regularly presenting concerts in this space. But you also had jazz concerts and recreations of some of the stage shows that happened during the Paradise Theater years.
That's because that's how strong the name meant. The history of it, people were still around who knew about the Paradise Theater. So it was only natural when they tried to save this building to bring that in. The idea was, and a bunch of people got together and said, let's do a Back to Paradise series.
So even through the renovation, you had a hall that was speaking to many different kinds of communities and all building support for the idea of saving this beautiful historic building.
Even when the orchestra was performing at Ford Auditorium, the musicians in the orchestra knew that this great space existed, and they wanted to really help gather a lot of support to bring the orchestra back on stage here at Orchestra Hall. And that was a big challenge because obviously there was a lot of money that was needed to fix the hall, to repair the hall.
You know, we've got pictures all around the building, all around the offices. You can see the, all of the storied supporters of this venture, like standing there pointing to the hole in the roof where you could see the sky, and bird nests in here, and it was just in bad shape. So whenever I tell that to people as they're standing here looking at this space, which just, looks ornate and beautiful and perfect, honestly, they don't believe it.
I think that this love of the space, the tenacity that people showed in embracing the space in spite of its condition, speaks to the identity that Orchestra Hall has. And that's what I love about the history, is that the hall itself has its own voice, its own life, maybe like its own heartbeat. And no one has been able to deny it who's come in and experienced it.
That's what saved us when we were trying to save Orchestra Hall, that there was enough here that it was, of course, a given that it was going to be saved, it was going to survive.
We were just so pleased that we finally had reconstructed something that was so important, had such integrity, and that as a city we had felt the value. Because after all, we had torn down the old city hall and torn down so many other places, but this we had taken the time and the interest to reconstruct, so it was important.
I think it was a turning point in the sound of the orchestra, because the sound of the orchestra in Ford Auditorium was stifled. And when we moved here, the orchestra came alive. Everyone came alive.
In 1989, the DSO returned to the hall stage and a sold-out crowd. But in spite of the triumph of that night, the orchestra's financial situation remained grim, and it was clear they would need more than just a restored building to lead the organization and its hall into a new golden age.